Hello, everyone. So, this is going to be a rundown of the books that I have read this year. It's a very long list, over 100 books. This year's theme was Unfinished Nasty, I call it, and basically, sort of a variation on the word unfinished business. A decent amount of these books are going to be books that I had read a little bit already from. Books, they were excerpts and whatnot from classes I had taken in college. And let's just get right into it. I apologize in advance if I'm, hard pressed to find a word to describe a book, because this is all going to be just off the cuff today. So, the first, Exploring Crime Analysis, a good read for anybody who wants to just get in crime analysis but knows nothing about it. Pretty dry read, but very interesting. Spooked. This is about the people associated with the Steele dossier. And regardless of where you stand on the political aisle, those were despicable people, like Glenn Simpson and all them. The 9/11 Commission. I had to read some of this while I was at MSU, and I decided to just finish the whole thing. The Last Duel, about the last legal duel in France. We Are Bellingcat. I'm huge into open source intelligence and open source research, and this book is about a firm that pretty much does some of the best work in that area. The Federalist Papers. I think if you're just a student coming of age in America, you have to read some of this in high school and in college, so I decided, okay, I'll complete the whole thing. The Catcher in the Rye. Good book. At the same time, I did not like the main character. Privacy in the Age of Big Data. Boy, is this book very, very relevant. And assigned to me when I was getting my undergraduate degree in IT. Probably needs updating, though. Secrets of Ireland. This is a nice, relaxing picture book. The Spy Masters. How the CIA Directors Shape History and the Future. A quick, fascinating read, although this is a fanboy piece very clearly. Unmasked, about the local terrorist organization. About the domestic terrorist group Antifa. Zero Fail, the rise and fall of the Secret Service. This is about the many foibles experienced by the Secret Service, what the Secret Service's job entails. I mean, yeah, okay, we know guarding the president. That's definitely a portion of it. What a lot of people would be shocked, though, is actually how small the Secret Service is. Only a couple thousand people. The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. I got to admit, I was a huge, huge fan of this movie when I was a little kid. And so, naturally, I wanted to read the book, and the book did not let me down. Really good one. A Man Without a Country, memoirs of Kurt Vonnegut. He was an interesting subject. And, I always like to say when I think of Kurt Vonnegut, I don't know how American high schools are now, but back in the day, you had the Vonnegut guy, and he was kind of edgy because he read Kurt Vonnegut and all that. Okay, so this was actually part of a week challenge I gave myself called By Bio. Read 2 biographies in 1 week. When Heaven and Earth Changed Places. This is a book about somebody who at one point did work for the Viet Cong, but then switched allegiances, actually lives in the United States, providing she's still alive. Anne Frank, Diary of a Young Girl. I don't think that this one needs any explaining. I mean, it's a pretty popular book. Privatizing Justice, and God, I love that cover. This gets into privatizing justice. Obviously, a lot of people don't know what a huge commercial complex the correction system is. Make Your Bed, just kind of a motivational thing from William McRaven. Richard Preston, The Demon in the Freezer. For some strange reason, these past year or so, I've been reading plague books. So The Demon in the Freezer talks about basically bioweapons. Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. I'm in awe of these guys who can take these complex theories, work them out in their head, and also on top of that have great communication skills to make, people like me able to absorb it. On the Ho Chi Minh Trail. From this list, you're going to gather that I study the war in Vietnam, specifically the U.S. war, not so much the war they had with China. Barely know about that. But on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the Blood Road, the women who defended it, and the legacy. Part history book, part travelogue. A really good piece, though, if you want the perspective of North Vietnamese women. Hill 488. Okay, another Vietnam read. So this is about one of the first um, battles that happened in Vietnam, so to speak. Hill 488 is just designated because probably that's the height of the hill. One very long, sustained firefight. A hell of an impressive book, though, and man, those guys really went through something. A Room of One's Own. This is a nonfiction by Virginia Woolf. And yeah, I think this is the only Virginia Woolf book I've ever read. The Age of Scurvy. How a surgeon, a mariner, and a gentleman helped Britain win the Battle of Trafalgar. This is a good book, and it is the best one-day read. That's a book I read in one day of the year. Deadliest Special Ops Snipers, The Reaper. Oh, great! Hell of a great book. Yeah, this is about the because I fought. I was deployed to Iraq, and was actually embedded with this unit. I did the some of the intelligence administration. Vietnam River Rain Craft. So this is the Vanguard series by Osprey, and what they're masters of is they make very small books, but about very specific things. Like they'll talk about a specific operation and go in depth with it, but still you got a nice book that you can sit down and read and pound out over the weekend. Versus some other books that are try to encompass everything are 700 pages, hard to get around to. Violence against women in pornography. And the professor here, Marilyn Corsianos, I don't think I've ever met her or saw her. It's possible, because for a while I was doing social science stuff with Eastern Michigan University. I absolutely cannot stand their sociology, anthropology, and criminology department. But this book tended to be rubbish because I thought it was going to be a human rights book or a research piece on violent and its depiction in pornography, and essentially all you get is two people whining that they don't like nudity and such. The New Jim Crow by, I think, Alexander Michel. This is a book about the current mass incarceration crisis we have. We've really got to rethink things here as far as corrections goes. We went to having 1 million people incarcerated. I forget when that happened, sometime I think in the late 90s, early aughts. And then we just a couple of years ago got to 2 million. So when you think of the history of incarceration and how quickly we went from 1 million to 2 million, it's kind of a blink of an eye, and that's scary. What's next? Up 3 million? On Killing. Now, this book actually is pretty good, and it has sort of a tie-in with the previous book in a way, because it talks about violence, tradecraft, and everything like that. Everything you want to know about the psychological side of violence and the cost of violence. Very good read. Okay, so there's a theme with me, obviously. Yeah, I do investigative work at all this and into researching crime and whatnot and warfare. So naturally, Hannah Arendt with On Violence was a good read to me. It gets into, some people say that the state is just, by its definition, almost a form of violence. That's what gives things legitimacy. And Hannah Arendt, Arendt, I think is how it's pronounced, argues the opposite. Ayn Rand, The Virtue of Selfishness. This was actually a good read and interesting musing. I was turned off by Ayn Rand because of her fanboys. There's these people that ask, well, what's your 3 favorite authors? And they'll say, Ayn Rand. Okay, you've proved your point. Stop doing that. But no, really smart. Brings up some interesting stuff that I never thought of about us as a species. In Small Things Forgotten, an Archaeology of Early American Life. This is James Dietz, and what he does throughout this is he puts an emphasis on essentially the trash or rubbish of like the 1600s. Very fascinating. Helmet for my pillow. If you want to know what the Asian side of World War II was like in the island hopping campaign, this is it. I read this to get a better understanding of my grandfather, the grandfather on my mother's side. I'm going to steal a line from my brother Sean, and I hope that he's not too mad about that. The ultimate Depression era badass. Outlander Scotland. So if you read, so there's a book series and TV series Outlander, and this is just a thing of the locations they're in. Lonely Planet's Beautiful World. I've actually been to a couple of places that were in this book. Carl Sagan, Pale Blue Dot. Boy, I try as much as possible to avoid saying, hey, if you only read one book this year, and I'm not going to do that with Carl Sagan. All I will say is that this is a great this is a great nonfiction book for almost anybody that's out there. You know, he calls for a lot of reforms and stuff. He's a real, Carl Sagan was probably one of the few atheists who was not a jerk. So The Pale Blue Dot is almost a philosophical work, and it's actually a very light read given the fact that it was a book by an astrophysicist. The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, and yes, he did pronounce it Du Bois, not Dubois. So this is a good work of sociology if you're into that kind of thing. It discusses the ramifications of slavery and all that. 3 Cups of Deceit. This is John Krakauer exposing, I forget what charity it is, but it was I think Central Asian Studies or whatever, Central Asia group, and basically how they rip people off. The Bridge at Dongha. This was a good piece about a Marine captain who had to blow up a bridge so that the NVA couldn't just storm it. It's very interesting to think because that happened in 1972 when America had ceased combat operations, but we still had a bunch of advisors over there. And advisor will mean whatever you want it to mean. It's very interesting, though, to think that this might have been the push that took Saigon if they didn't take out the bridge, and we'd see 3 years later that they'd do the push again. Policing China. So I'm interested in criminal justice, and of course, right now, pretty much everybody is interested in China. It's a country that's been around for a very, very, very long time, and it looks sort of poised to be the next superpower. Now, of course, that could change, but, that's 1 billion people. That's a huge chunk of humanity over there. The Bridge at Remagen. One of the more interesting chapters of World War II. World War II, such a massive topic. And this book is about the specific bridge that was taken. And the significance of that was that it allowed the Allies to get across the Rhine. Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington. This was interesting for so many reasons. Number one, yes, Booker T. Washington was a slave. So that's going to be interesting. But also his perspective on the Civil War, He was often asked by people in the North as the South was folding and as the battles were raging, was he excited? Was he happy? And gets into just how it was to be a slave in the Civil War. And, to see just plumes of smoke rising and deserters preying on people. It was scary for him. Yeah, it's good they got liberated, but he leaves out no details about how bad war is. Also, how anticlimactic it was to be a freed slave, because there was no real plan in place as to what to do about the slaves. The Clash of Civilizations. This book is probably the most controversial book that I read. Samuel Huntington essentially argues that we are into various civilization blocks the world is, and that those blocks will always will war with one another. Even if we come up with technologies that allow for a horn of plenty, so to speak, you know, we're gonna fight. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So on this book, two of the influences for my reading list here are, my best friend Harry and my buddy Yusuf. And this is a book that he actually recommended, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It's very interesting because all of the research is pulled from the Israeli archives itself. And let me tell you, it's brutal. And I don't think there's any easy solutions. With the old breed. Now, this is going to differ from Helmet for My Pillow for one reason. This was written by a guy who actually is a professor of English, and therefore it's a bit more weighty and heavier of a piece than Helmet for My Pillow. Black Ops: The Life of a CIA Shadow Warrior by Rick Prado. This is good for several reasons. Obviously, there's the diversity of this. It's written by, a Latin American guy who was actually born outside the United States. And it's interesting because it's the history of the CIA. Code Over Country. Boy, my brother Bo is just going to have a field day with this one. This is about the numerous screw ups of SEAL Team 6. Islam and Democracy. I was actually inspired to read this by both, yes, my buddy Yusuf, and also Samuel Huntington mentions this book in A Clash of Civilizations. The Allure of Chanel. I actually worked at a place that sold designer clothing and all that, and we did have some Chanel in. Man, I honestly really do miss it. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. I actually have read this numerous times. It's just a good book. The Constitution of the United States of America with the Declaration of Independence. Um, yeah, I don't know anybody who'd probably make it through high school or college that wasn't assigned to read at least one of the amendments. Warrior of the Light. This is by the guy who wrote The Alchemist. I like that. A Warrior of the Light was an interesting book, although it was definitely not as good as The Alchemist. I used to know that. World History. This was a fun book series put out by Reader's Digest or whatever publication group owns Reader's Digest. This is what you used to call a bathroom reader. Richard Castle. I loved the show Castle. The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. This is one of those I got out of a free library and just hammered it out one day at work. Octopussy by Ian Fleming. So I count Octopussy and then Living Daylights as two books, even though when I bought it, it was a sort of double compendium. They were released as two books. If you have seen these movies, you can still enjoy the books, because frankly, the James Bond books, are really, really good, and it's completely different. James Bond in the movies would never really work as an intelligence operative. He draws way too much attention to himself. Living Daylights. Living Daylights is very interesting because we learned that there was an incident in the past where James Bond, even though he's just strictly an analyst, got into during World War II, and he had to get out of it. And he killed a lot of people in doing that. And so he's picked to essentially pick off a sniper. And there's a lot of musings about, him, what is violence being used for? You kill someone takes their place and whatnot. So, and they don't explain though why this particular sniper is standing up, showing off their breasts, and has no pants. Fun fact, most people in the military don't do that. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Great horror read. I read this actually out of season. I usually only read spooky books during October, but good read here. And I feel that the violence in this book is very realistic. Also, but do keep in mind the slaying of one of the better characters is pretty graphic. Teddy and Me by Michael Savage. Picked that out of this free library at work and read it. I gotta admit I didn't like it because I don't necessarily like Michael Savage. Truman Capote in Cold Blood. You know, as much as I have read a lot on criminology, the two works, though, that are true crime, I hadn't read till this year. So I read Truman Capote in Cold Blood. That was good. Zodiac. Great book about the Zodiac Killer. Open Source Intelligence Techniques, 9th edition. This is one of those books, I'm going to actually create a separate video, that helps you not just to, that's helpful not just to read, but to tell you how to think about something. Helter Skelter, The True Story of the Manson Murders. This has been called the best-selling true crime of all time, so naturally I wanted to read it. Killers of the Flower Moon, another good true crime. Bad Blood, true crime book by Kararu. This was about that Theranos Elizabeth Holmes scam that happened. Yeah, she's in jail now for a couple years, and she deserves it, and a lot more, frankly. Black Dahlia Red Rose. This was an interesting piece. I'm not quite sure what inspired the author to write it, but it was a good book about, you know, one of the most infamous unsolved murders, and it delves into the psychological side of why are we obsessed with this particular murder. And it ain't like there hasn't been one this week. Kevin. Loincloth Kev. K-bow. Ponytail. Oh God. This book. Really awful book. I mean, the only reason why I think it honestly sold, given how bad it is that it came out round about the time COVID was coming out, and the storyline features a plague. The Slave Across the Street, I'm going to call it like I see it. I think this Teresa Flores person is an absolute con woman. And the reason for that is there's a lot of information in this book that just doesn't add up if you actually live in Michigan and know locations and stuff like that. The Michigan Murders. This book is often put in the true crime section. It is not a true crime book. As I think to defend the author's changing of various things, you know, when a trial is ongoing, as murder trials are, you know, in the appeals process, you really are worried about getting sued and stuff like that, and he wanted to write it before it was all finalized. I would say skip this book because I'm going to get to one that's so much better. American Predator, The Hunt for the Most Meticulous Serial Killer of the 21st Century. Great book. Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. A wonderful book and a great movie where Kevin Spacey plays the villain. And man, it's really interesting to watch those and think that, A, he is a villain, so that's fascinating. But it's like, man, there was a time where we liked him. But this gets into sort of the, I guess you could call it the Gothic South. And just all the intrigue that went on there back in the day when it was slaveholding, and still actually goes on there to this day. It's fascinating. There's just something about the Deep South that setting it there feels like it almost becomes a character in and of itself. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Boy, this was a weird piece, and it's one of these, you know, I mostly read nonfiction. So there are books, this is one of those books that a lot of people read when they're in their teens or their 20s or whatnot. So I got around to it this year. Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. This is sort of a slice of life, day in the life of this neighborhood, if you will. Well, not day, I should say a season. In this neighborhood that's, you know, kind of, I guess you would say, a bit trashy, but it's nevertheless pretty good. I like John Steinbeck. World of Wonders, this was Book of the Year. I forget for which year, though. That always throws me off because the Book of the Year is usually one that was published previously. Just a good musing on nature and stuff like that. Murder on the Orient Express, if you like great detective stories. Sister Outsider, a good book by Audre Lorde. I myself am not a progressive or social justice warrior, but you may want to read this to see where a lot of the current movement of intersectionality came from. Stuff Trump Says. I'm keeping this one PG. Personally, with Trump, not everything he did I hate. I think there's some foreign policy nuggets in there. I do think, though, that he was self-defeating in his speech. Psychology 101, just a fascinating book if you took some psych courses but don't necessarily remember a lot. Missoula by John Krakauer. This book has me a bit polarized on some things. He goes into some graphic details, and I think maybe that actually works against the book, but you can be the judge, read it yourself. John Krakauer, I think there's only one other book by John Krakauer I haven't read. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, or however, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I'm probably butchered the pronunciation of both of those Russian names. I want to get into him, maybe read the Gulag Archipelago or whatever it is. But, this worked as a good introduction. Stop the Killing, How to End the Mass Shooting Crisis. Good book by an FBI agent who is from and lives in Michigan. The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. I wanted to get around to closing out the Holmes canon, but it's a bit difficult because the remaining books I have to read are short story compilations, and I really don't like those. Hard Measures, Jose Rodriguez. Very public fall from the CIA this guy had. But, another thing too, when you're trying to add to your diversity list, John Krakauer, Where Men Win Glory. This is an interesting intersection of both crime, in a way, and warfare. Pat Tillman was, killed by his own people, unfortunately, such as the fog of war. That happens in every war. His Last Vow, another Sherlock Holmes book. The Anti-Federalist Papers. This is actually pretty interesting because, you had the Federalist, then you had the Anti-Federalist. Anti-Federalist, of course, wrote a lot less than the Federalist. Dewey, this is just an adorable story about a library cat that became very, very popular around the world. Red Notice, good book about Vladimir Putin and what's going on in Russia. Also, I used a cover shot from an audiobook, but none of the books I have listed here are audiobooks. I didn't do any audiobooking this year. Just regular books. Any readers. I Am Legend. If you've seen the movie, you can still really enjoy this book. Yeah, I was talking to people at work, and we were all of the consensus that there's never been a horror treatment of I Am Legend. They've all been action movies. I mean, no disgrace to Charlton Heston in Omega Man. And I would like to say no disgrace to Will Smith in I Am Legend, of course. He went on to disgrace himself. But no, I don't feel that anybody has nailed the horror aspect of this book. And this was, of course, my buddy Yusuf purchased this book, and I purchased this book so I could read it and get done with it before he even started it. Because I'm that way. To Kill a Mockingbird. A lot of people have told me that they read this they were assigned to read this book in high school or whatnot. And if you were assigned to read and read it, hey, good for you. I was never assigned to me. But I've heard from everybody, I've heard from multiple sources. If you only read one fiction book this year, read To Kill a Mockingbird. This book was hyped before I even opened the cover. And some people say to have had low expectations and still be disappointed. I would say to have had high expectations, and buddy, this book skyrockets over them. Truly a good book to write. I believe Harper Lee only published 2 books. And, but hey, if you're only going to publish one and it's the caliber of this, there ain't no shame in that, brother. The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. This is a good book, of course, for the security side of things. And what it does is it takes, what do. Sometimes we have this feeling of danger. What are we picking up exactly? What's making us feel fear? And I'm not talking about the fear of, like, if you have like a phobia of dolls, or like me, you're arachnophobic or whatever. It talks about kind of your life in danger type of stuff. Also, this is a good book for just men to read in general. Mining Social Media. This was an interesting book, and this upcoming year, 2023, I really want to go through the exercises of this book. I have a undergraduate degree in IT, but I was never able to land a job within that field. And so my IT skills over the years, they just aren't that impressive. I really want to get back into that, but you run out of time and stuff like that. Endymion. So this book, you either kind of know the gist of this or you don't. Dan Simmons wrote this thing called the Hyperion Cantos. It's 4 books, a quartet as they would say, and it's 4 books, but it's kind of divided into 2 duologies. You have this vast galactic empire, and then you had its fall, I guess you would say. And in Endymion, you have the rise, the birth of it, like over 100 years later. How to Lie with Statistics. Again, this is a book that's going to get you thinking about how you think, if that makes any sense. Spec Ops, another book by William McRaven. A very good, interesting piece, because this was actually started off as a thesis for his war college. Ken Follett on Wings of Eagles. So Ken Follett is a great author. He has written 2 books that sold millions. I forget what one of them was. It was a spy thriller. But the other one is The Pillars of the Earth. And this is a nonfiction book about a prison escape in Iran. And I love it when a fiction author who's well-tested, well-written, well-publicized takes on nonfiction. And the reason why I love that so much is very simple, because they can tell a story. The National Reconnaissance Office at 50 years. This is a brief history of a kind of obscure intelligence agency. So this is the Research for a Future in Space. One of the many books I read through my e-reader. You get these for like 99 cents off of Amazon. Solar and Space Physics, another good one. Dark Psychology and Manipulation. Yeah, this book, this author, I don't think he knows what he's talking about. I wouldn't put much faith in this guy. The Rise of Endymion, last of the Hyperion Cantos books. Priorities for Geoent Research. Interesting book by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They do some really, really cool things. I know a lot of people know about the NSA, CIA, and all that. But, give these other obscure ones some of your attention, because you find out some fascinating stuff. Technopoly by Neil Postman. So, I wanted to read this, especially after 2019 when I took a class at Michigan State University just called Terrorism. And because, as you know, Ted Kaczynski, one of the inspirations for him bombing so many places, he's the Unabomber, was the rise of technology and how it's become ingrained in our daily life. The History of Witchcraft. Okay, so during the month of October, I switched to Spooky Reads. So, and I have this challenge, and it's usually I try to read a horror book, just straight up fiction horror book. I try to read nonfiction horror, which is uh, either like a history of hauntings or something like this. So, the history of witchcraft, Mists of Mackinac by a local, I think they live in Ann Arbor, a spirit medium who goes there. Um, this is what The Thing by John Carpenter is lifted from. The Woofin. Okay, so if you ask me what book was a real surprise for you, this one. Because it's a book about. I don't know if werewolf would be the right word, but just read this book, man. Good book, and it's actually realistic. Stephen King's Cycle of the Werewolf. Sometimes the problem with Stephen King is he does these exposition dumps and stuff like that, and just info dumps and things. And Cycle of the Werewolf, though, is a very small piece that anybody can get through in pretty much a week. Autumn Crow. Cameron Chaney wears his influence on his sleeve, and this is clearly him channeling Christopher Pike and the Fear Street series by R.L. Stine. Wicked Ypsilanti. I actually know this author. Urban Legends, the world's most popular urban legends. Terror in Ypsilanti. So this is the book that I told you earlier that I was going to get to, because it was so much better than the other book, The Michigan Murders. More thorough in every way, and written by somebody who was actually a local at the time the murders were taking place. How to Spot a Fake Rolex. Really is kind of a time waster for me, but I worked in a designer goods store, and you do have to learn to spot fake merchandise. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Whew. This book is brutal. I mean, it really is. It catalogs what slavery, the brutal aspects of slavery, and also too just how evil some women can be to other women. I mean, they don't spare details. Right now, there's a lot of controversy as to what they should teach in schools, and I think definitely it's okay to teach the history that there was slavery, but there are some things in there. In Combat Veteran, I'm like, oh, I wince at some of this stuff. It's like, you gotta be careful. The Big Book of Unexplained Mysteries. Kind of a light read, just interesting cataloging of the paranormal. A History of Magic, Witchcraft, and the Occult by DK. DK does these, massive books that are references. Maritime Academy Graduate. This, if you've ever wondered what it's like to be on a merchant vessel, you won't want to after this. Sleeper Agent, recommended to me by Noel at my work. The Atomic Spy in America Who Got Away. Great piece on real intelligence operative. The Occult, Witchcraft, and Magic in Illustrated History. I believe I read this book on October 31st, on Halloween. George Orwell, Notes on Nationalism. It is obviously kind of similar to the Vonnegut book mentioned earlier. George Orwell, Down and Out in Paris and London. Boy, restaurants are disgusting places. That's not the only takeaway from here, but it's interesting. This one kind of is hard to say whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and I think it's nonfiction with some liberties taken. James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. This is a sort of book on America, race relations, and reckoning. Good guy, James Baldwin. Obviously, very important figure in the civil rights movement. And, of course, in addition to being African American, he's also homosexual. And this is a time when, there were prejudices against both those. This is a book about the Boko Haram kidnapping of those girls at that school. You kind of remember the incident I'm talking about, or you don't. The War Against Civilians. I saw this actually recommended in the British Journal of Criminology. And again, this is definitely the influence of my buddy Yusuf because he's into this human rights stuff. Mortality, a book by Christopher Hitchens, his musings about dying. Darkness Visible, Memoir of Madness. This is about a man struggling with depression. A Rumor of War is considered a modern classic. It's about Vietnam and the early days of it. Philip Caputo is very interesting because he went to Vietnam in 1965. Then he came back as a war correspondent in 75 and had to get the hell out of Dodge real fast. Definitely the influence of my buddy Harry, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. My buddy Harry is the one who does the philosophy reads. And so I decided to look into this. It's very interesting because Viktor Frankl points out that it's often not so much tragedy that happens to you that causes people to be depressed and hopeless. It's tragedy if no meaning could actually come from it. And it's very he talks specifically about how he mentioned that a lot of people would die in these death camps. Viktor Frankl was at multiple death camps. That they would die sort of hopelessness. It was interesting in December. In other words, maybe they had this mentality of I'll just make it through this year and the war will be over and we'll be liberated and whatnot. When that didn't happen, they became hopeless. Amusing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman. So this was a book I was assigned to read by, I believe, Professor Campbell when I was at Concordia. Oh man, that was back in the day. I read, and I don't think he had us read the whole book. I think he just had us read an excerpt. But either way, it was so long ago that the information in here is very refreshing. It, talks about, granted it talks about television, and we can talk about internet now. But it's relevant that our thinking has changed much. How the Irish Saved Civilization. Really good history piece by Thomas Cahill. Neil Postman, again, The Disappearance of Childhood. This gets into some very uncomfortable stuff here with how children are being treated and stuff like that, what we're exposing children to. Talks about the sexualization of children, which is a topic that other books I've read this year after this address. The Dragons of Eden. Speculations on the evolution of human intelligence. Really fascinating book, and I think it's interesting that Parseltongues could have existed. Nomad Land. A great book about a portion of Americans, basically the elderly who are not financially secure. We have an aging population here in the United States, and we got to address the economics of that. There is Social Security, but it ain't that much. This was also a movie. I generally don't get into like movies with these things which are tying. The movie was pretty good. The End of History and The Last Man. So this is the exact opposite of the clash of civilizations. Basically, Francis Fukuyama argues that liberal democracy is the most evolved form of governments, and that all countries in the world are progressing to that. And when that happens, because liberal democracies don't fight each other, you'll have world peace. Obviously, he's very incorrect about that. Look at the authoritarian regimes that are springing up all over the world. Now, what I will give him credit for is he takes on the realist perspective of international relations, and he comes up with some great arguments against it. The Sexualized Child in Foster Care. So I actually have there's actually a library on the second floor of where I work. That's all books for the professionals if you work at the Department of Health and Human Services in Michigan. This is an interesting book because it's divided into 3 parts, kind of. It talks about what is appropriate sexual behavior and how difficult it is, because if you go for children, and if you ask 9,000 people what proper sexual behavior is, they're going to give you the answer according to them. And so it's hard to hammer out what is appropriate when a kid's manifesting appropriate versus inappropriate behavior. And then it gets into people, children that have been victims of sex abuse. And then the last part of it, the third part, is interestingly enough dedicated to juvenile sex offenders. And yes, we are seeing a rise of sex crimes that are committed by people who are very, very young. Growing up in Westland, one of my best buddies was an offender, and we were very, very young. And he didn't offend. He didn't offend me. I want to make clear that. But no, he was booked and everything like that, and there's a file on it. Why didn't she keep me? Answers to the question every adopted child asks. Obviously, I work around foster care people and stuff like that. This book was up there. And very interesting book. Sometimes in the debates about family and kids and all that, I think we lose sight of the families that are actually affected. And when we talk about adoption or abortion, we're talking about women, they've been through something. This book I found was very interesting. It's essentially just her asking various people why they gave their kids up for adoption. There's some interesting surprises there. I think we all associate giving a child up for adoption to is like a teen mother thing. But no, that's not the case. There are many actual reasons for it, and whatnot. I would say this: if you're a pro-choice type of person, this might not be the book for you. These women sound off very loudly on abortion in some cases. So that was it. I want to close by talking about other people in the BookTube universe here. Read with Hannah. She's on Book Talk. SFF 180, that's a YouTube channel. I often disagree with that person's politics, but hey, I always agree with their reviews generally. The Shades of Orange BookTube channel, it's a channel dedicated to horror books. But the person who runs the channel is this perky, upbeat Canadian soccer mom. And then there's Triumphal Reads. Triumphal Reads stands out here because this person often reads non-fiction books and fiction books as well, whereas most YouTube channels are dedicated to fiction. So this actually makes him a very cool person. Epic Reads. So Epic Reads is a great BookTube channel. It's probably the most popular, and I don't necessarily know why I feel a compulsion to do this, but I do feel like telling people that this is not an independent YouTube channel, Epic Reads. It is affiliated with HarperCollins. Now, I would also like to say that, reading all these books proves that if you have a library card, you can educate yourself, essentially. Which brings me to my closing point. Defund public education. I don't feel that these schools are doing their job, and people say, oh, Stephen, what do we do about the teachers? It's like, we can feed them to the homeless. Either way, I hope that 2022 was a great reading year for you, and I'm going to be releasing some videos about the various books I read this year more in depth. Thank you.